The hospital director grabbed her by the arm and shoved her through the emergency exit doors into a Montana blizzard at 11 o'clock at night. She stumbled, caught herself on the railing, and turned back to look at him through the glass. He didn't flinch. "Don't come back," Director Warren Pollock said. "You're done." What Warren Pollock did not know, what nobody inside Cascade Ridge Medical Center knew, was that the woman he had just thrown into the snow had once kept 8 Special Forces operators alive for 16 hours in a collapsed mountain position, with nothing but field dressings, improvised tourniquets, and the kind of controlled rage that only comes from refusing to let someone die on your watch. He threw out the wrong woman. And before the storm was over, he would understand exactly what that meant. Before we get into this story, if you're watching this right now, hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you want to see justice happen. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has traveled. Let's get into it. The blizzard had started around 4 in the afternoon, the way Montana storms always did. Quietly, then all at once. By 6, the interstate into Garrison Falls was impassable in both directions. By 8, the county had declared a weather emergency and every road crew in the valley had been pulled back to base. By 10:30, the temperature outside Cascade Ridge Medical Center had dropped to -14, and the wind was moving fast enough to knock a grown man sideways. Nora Vance knew all of this because she had been watching the weather strip on the break room TV between patients for the past 4 hours. She also knew that the ER was running short on saline bags, that Bed 3 still hadn't been cleaned from the overdose case at 7, and that the heating vent above the nurses' station had been rattling for 6 weeks without anyone fixing it. She knew these things because she was the kind of person who noticed. She had always been the kind of person who noticed. She poured the last of the break room coffee into a cup, didn't bother with sugar, and carried it back to the nursing floor. The overnight shift at Cascade Ridge was not glamorous work. It never had been. The hospital was mid-sized, underfunded in the ways that didn't show up in press releases, and positioned in a part of Montana where the nearest Level 1 trauma center was a 2-hour drive on a clear day and functionally unreachable in weather like tonight. The staff knew this. They worked around it. Most of them had been doing it long enough that they'd developed a certain quiet competence, the ability to make do, to improvise, to hold things together with tape and experience when the situation asked for it. Nora fit in well enough. She'd been at Cascade Ridge for 3 years. She worked nights by choice. She kept her head down, did her job, and didn't engage much with hospital politics beyond what was necessary to protect her patients. The other nurses on the floor liked her well enough, though most of them would have admitted, if pressed, that they didn't really know her. She deflected personal questions with a small, practiced smile and a subject change. She ate lunch alone more often than not. She had a habit of moving through a room like she was cataloging it. Quick eyes, measured steps, a kind of physical economy that some people found slightly unnerving, and others just never noticed. What the other nurses didn't know, what nobody at Cascade Ridge knew, was that Nora Vance was not the name on her military discharge papers. Her discharge papers said Margaret. Nora Vance, Sergeant, United States Army, Bravo Medical Detachment, 10th Special Forces Group, retired on a medical administrative separation that was technically voluntary and technically classified. The certificate of achievement folded in the bottom of a storage box in her apartment listed an operation that had no official name and had never been publicly acknowledged. The commendation below it referenced actions taken in a mountain environment under hostile conditions and cited her specifically for sustained medical care provided under direct fire over a period exceeding 14 hours, resulting in 0 fatalities among 8 critically injured personnel, 8 men who had walked into a mountainside and should not have come out. She didn't talk about it. She didn't display it. She had driven past the VFW hall in Garrison Falls maybe a dozen times in 3 years and had never gone inside. She was 34 years old and she was tired in a specific bone-level way that had nothing to do with the overnight shift. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway and picked up the next chart. The man came in at 10:51 p.m., brought by a county snowplow operator who had nearly run him over on Route 9 heading north out of town. The plow driver, a heavy-set guy named Dale, who was still shaking when he came through the doors, said he'd seen the man crawling on the shoulder, barely visible through the snow. No vehicle nearby, no coat, jeans and a thermal undershirt, both soaked through. He hadn't been able to say anything coherent since Dale pulled him into the cab. The intake staff got him onto a gurney and started a primary assessment. Nora was doing a med check at the far end of the corridor when she heard the commotion and walked toward it on instinct. She came around the corner and looked at the man on the gurney and felt something in her chest tighten in a way that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. He was in bad shape. Frostbite on both hands, probably both feet, lips bluish, skin mottled, respirations were shallow and irregular. But it wasn't the cold alone that concerned her. There was something else. Something about the way he was holding his left side without moving it, and the faint discoloration spreading up from under his shirt along his rib cage, and the particular quality of his breathing that was just slightly wrong in a way that took a certain kind of experience to read correctly. She moved closer. The intake nurse, a younger woman named Priya, was calling out vitals. BP 88/60. Heart rate 118 and climbing. O2 sat at 91. "What's his name?" Nora asked. "No ID," Priya said. "Nothing on him." "No wallet? No phone?" "Nothing. Dale said he was alone on the road." Nora leaned in and looked at the man's abdomen through the shirt. The discoloration was spreading, not frostbite coloring. Wrong hue, wrong pattern. Her mind ran the calculation without asking permission. "He needs imaging right now," she said. "Abdomen. I want to know if there's internal bleeding." Priya looked at her. "I need to get authorization from the attending for... Where's Dr. Kessler?" "He's in with the cardiac case in 2. He said he's not to be disturbed unless... Get him anyway." Priya hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Nora's patience. She turned and walked directly to exam room 2 and knocked twice and opened the door. Dr. Marcus Kessler was a decent emergency physician who had been running on 4 hours of sleep and 2 cups of vending machine coffee. He was in the middle of adjusting a medication drip, and he looked up at Nora with the kind of expression that men in positions of authority sometimes wear when they don't want to be questioned. "I said I wasn't to be disturbed. We have a male, unknown age, brought in off Route 9. No ID, no history. Vitals are crashing. BP's in the basement, tachycardic, low sat. He's got significant bruising spreading across the left upper quadrant, and his breathing pattern is off. I think he's bleeding internally." Kessler was already moving by the 3rd sentence, which told her he was better than his expression suggested. He came out into the corridor, assessed the man on the gurney in about 45 seconds, and ordered imaging and a type and cross and 2 large-bore IVs and a surgical consult. Good. That was the right call. Nora stayed with the patient while they got the line started. She kept one hand on his wrist, not checking the pulse, just present, the way she'd learned to do when someone was on the edge and needed another body close to anchor them. She'd had a medic instructor who said that once, back at Fort Carson. Sometimes the most medical thing you can do is just be there and not flinch. The man opened his eyes. They were gray-green and not as unfocused as she expected. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't let them stop the drip." "We're not stopping anything," she said. "Can you tell me your name?" He looked at the ceiling, a long pause, then, "Hargrove." "Okay, Hargrove, you're at Cascade Ridge Medical Center in Garrison Falls. You're going to imaging. Just keep breathing." His eyes tracked back to her. Something moved across his expression. Not recognition exactly, more like calculation. "Military," he said. "Excuse me?" "The way you put the line in." He stopped and breathed carefully. "Not nursing school." She didn't answer. They took him to imaging. Warren Pollock arrived at 11:15. He was not scheduled to be there. He was not the attending on call, was not the trauma lead, was not covering any clinical role. He was the hospital's executive director, the title the board had given him 2 years ago when they'd brought him in to restructure the operating budget and increase Cascade Ridge's quarterly performance metrics. His background was in healthcare administration, not medicine. He had an MBA from the University of Denver and a demonstrated ability to cut costs in ways that didn't immediately show up as patient deaths, which was apparently a skill set that commanded a significant salary. He'd driven in from his house 6 miles out because someone on the administrative overnight staff had flagged the situation. Unidentified patient, no insurance information on file, no guarantor, No documentation of any kind, presenting during a declared weather emergency. This was, in Pollack's framework, a financial risk event. He came in through the administrative entrance, which he used because it had a covered parking area and the other entrances did not, and he walked directly to the nursing station and asked for a status update on the unidentified patient. Priya gave him the basics. Pollack listened. His expression was the particular kind of neutral that people learn when they want to appear as though they're listening carefully while actually making a different calculation. "No identification at all," he said. "No, sir. And no documentation of insurance status, Medicaid eligibility, anything of that nature. We haven't been able to get any. He was barely conscious when he came in." Pollack nodded slowly. He looked at the monitoring station, at the board, at the bed allocation. Then he said, "I want to move to a holding bay until we can establish financial responsibility." The nursing station went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when a statement has been made that everyone in the room knows is wrong, but nobody immediately says so out loud. Nora was at the station filling out the imaging order when Pollack said it. She set down the pen. "He's in imaging right now," she said. "Dr. Kessler ordered a full abdominal workup. We think there's internal bleeding." Pollack looked at her. He didn't appear to recognize her as anything specific. She was a nurse in scrubs, overnight shift, which placed her somewhere below the administrative horizon in his mental organization of the hospital. "I'm not asking for a clinical update," he said. "I'm directing a resource allocation decision." "A resource allocation decision," she repeated, "until this patient's financial status is, he's bleeding internally." She said it the way you'd say something to a person who needed it, said very simply because the complexity was not the issue. Holding him in a bay without intervention isn't an option, not medically and not legally. EMTALA requires us to provide stabilizing treatment regardless of ability to pay. That's federal law. Pollack's expression shifted. "Not much. A small tightening around the eyes." "I'm aware of EMTALA," he said. "Then you know we can't do what you're describing." "What I'm describing," Pollack said, "is standard hospital protocol for unverified patients. If you have a problem with hospital protocol, I'd suggest you take it up through the appropriate channels." "The appropriate channel is right here," she said. "The patient's in imaging. Dr. Kessler has the case. The protocol that matters right now is the one that keeps that man from dying." There was a pause. Some of the other nurses at the station had found things to look at on their screens. Dr. Kessler was somewhere down the corridor, not present for this conversation. Pollack took one step toward the station. He lowered his voice by maybe 10%, which was meant to signal that this was now a private administrative conversation rather than a public one. "Nurse?" He stopped. "What's your name?" "Vance. Nora Vance." "Nurse Vance, I want to be very clear. This hospital runs because we maintain operational discipline. That means staff follow administrative direction. What I'm asking is a standard precautionary protocol, and your decision to challenge it publicly is a conduct issue." She looked at him. "You can document whatever you want. The patient goes to trauma care." Pollack straightened slightly. He had the look of someone recalibrating. Then he walked to the charge desk and asked for the on-call administrator. The imaging came back at 11:38. Nora looked at it over Kessler's shoulder. Splenic laceration. Not catastrophic, not yet, but grade 3, maybe edging toward 4, with a pocket of free fluid in the peritoneum that was going to require either close observation and intervention-ready standby, or, if he destabilized, emergency surgery. "We need a surgical consult," Kessler said, which was the right call. "Dolan's the on-call surgeon," Nora said. "He's 30 minutes out in this weather. Get him moving." She got Dolan on the phone. He said he'd be there in 40, conditions allowing. She asked him to move fast. While she was on the phone, she watched Pollack through the window of the nurse's station. He was on his own phone. He had the on-call administrator beside him now, a man named Ferris, who wore a fleece with the hospital logo on it and always looked like he was trying to remember which side he was supposed to be on. At 11:52, Ferris came to Nora with a printed document. "This is a written notice of conduct review," he said. "Mr. Pollack wants it on record that you undermined administrative authority during a patient intake situation and that the matter will be reviewed." She took the paper. She read it. She handed it back. Noted, she said. Is the patient still getting surgical standby? Ferris blinked. That's a clinical matter. Yes, it is. Tell Mr. Pollock I'll be glad to discuss the conduct review at any time that isn't right now. She went back to the trauma bay. Hargrove, she still didn't have a first name, didn't have anything, was conscious again, which was either good news or complicated news depending on what was fueling it. His color was still bad. His vitals had stabilized marginally, not because the situation had improved, but because Kessler had gotten 2 liters of saline into him and his body was fighting. She stood at the bedside and checked his IV lines and looked at his monitor. They're arguing about whether to treat you, she said, because she figured he could probably tell something was going on, and the truth was better than a vague reassurance. I know, he said. You heard that? Walls are thin. A pause. How bad is it? Splenic laceration. We've got a surgeon coming. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not going to let them pull the case. It wasn't a question. No, she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. The calculation was still there. Something else, too, now. Garrison Falls, he said. Long way from the Korengal. She stilled. She kept her face neutral, because that was something she was very good at, but something in her chest moved that she hadn't felt in 3 years. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Sure you don't. He looked at the ceiling again. I'm not going to cause you trouble. I just want you to know I know. Know what exactly? He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with an expression that was tired and certain at the same time. That you're the real thing, he said. Whatever you're doing here. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she checked his lines again, adjusted his O2, and walked out to check on Dolan's ETA. Baran. Dolan arrived at 12:19, which was actually faster than 40 minutes given the road conditions, and Nora respected him for that. He reviewed the imaging, did a bedside assessment, and agreed with her read. Surgical standby, close observation, prep for emergency splenectomy if he dropped again. Pollock, who had been hovering at the administrative edge of the floor for the past hour, intercepted Dolan near the elevator. Nora couldn't hear the conversation. She watched it from the nursing station. Dolan's body language was initially relaxed, then progressively less so. He ended the conversation with a short nod and walked toward the surgical prep area without looking back. At 12:40, Ferris came back. He had another piece of paper. His expression suggested he found this task deeply unpleasant, which did not make him less willing to carry it out. Mr. Pollock is suspending you pending the conduct review, he said, effective immediately. He's asking you to surrender your access badge and leave the premises. The nursing station did not go quiet this time. It went very specifically, carefully busy. Everyone's eyes finding a task. Nora looked at the paper. In the middle of a shift, she said, I understand the timing is, the patient in Trauma Bay 1 is on surgical standby for a splenic laceration. His surgeon just got here 20 minutes ago. His primary nurse walking off the floor right now is a clinical safety issue. Mr. Pollock has authorized the charge nurse to cover the case. She looked over at Priya, who was at the far end of the station, and had clearly heard all of this and looked mortified. This is a retaliation action, Nora said. It's also incredibly stupid from a liability standpoint. I'm not in a position to pick. You're the on-call administrator. You're absolutely in a position. Ferris shifted his weight. For a moment, just a moment, something passed across his face that was close to agreement. Then it closed. I need your badge, Nurse Vance. She was quiet. She looked at the trauma bay. She looked at the monitor readout at the station. Hargrove's heart rate, respiration, BP, all of it scrolling in real time. She took the badge off. She set it on the desk. She went to the locker room, got her coat and her bag, and walked toward the exit. Pollock was waiting near the emergency exit doors. She didn't know if he'd planned it that way or if he just happened to be there, but either way, he was there. And when she came through with her coat and bag, he stepped partially into her path in a way that was not quite a block but was meant to be felt. You should have followed protocol, he said. She stopped. She looked at him. The full weight of what she knew about herself, about what she'd done and what she'd seen, and what she was capable of, sat very quietly behind her eyes. "Your patient is still in there," she said. "Whatever you think about me, make sure he gets his surgical standby. That's no longer your concern. It's everyone's concern." She looked at him one more second. "You should know what you just did." "I know exactly what I did," Pollock said. "I enforced policy." She went through the doors. The cold hit her like a wall, immediate, total, the kind of cold that catches you in the chest before you've braced for it. The wind was running hard across the parking lot, driving the snow sideways. She could barely see the light post at the edge of the lot. She stood on the steps for a moment, letting her body register the temperature. Her coat was good, but not designed for standing still in -14. She'd need to get to her car. She started across the lot. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see the lights of the ER, the nursing station, the monitors, the corridor that led to the trauma bay where Hargrove was lying on a gurney with a lacerated spleen and gray-green eyes that had said, "I know who you are," in a way that nobody had said to her in 3 years. She got to her car and sat in the driver's seat and started the engine and turned the heat to full and sat there while the vents blew cold air that would take 3 minutes to warm. She should drive home, get out of the storm, let the morning shift deal with the fallout. She pulled her phone out of her coat pocket. There were no missed calls, no messages. She sat with the phone in her hand and watched the snow come down and thought about the imaging she'd looked at over Kessler's shoulder. The pocket of free fluid, the laceration grade, the surgical margin that was good now but wouldn't stay good if something shifted. Thought about Dolan, who was competent but new to solo cases at this hospital and would be working tonight without a primary nurse who knew the patient's baseline. Thought about Hargrove saying, "You're the real thing, whatever you're doing here." Thought about the 8 men who had walked into a mountainside in a country she wasn't going to name even in her own head, and the 16 hours that came after, and the 1 man she had been too late for. The heat finally started coming out of the vents. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Montana area code, but not one she recognized. She stared at it for 2 rings. Then she picked up. The voice on the other end was male, measured, and carried the particular cadence of someone who had spent a long time in command environments and never entirely left them. "Is this Margaret Vance?" Everything in her went still. Nobody called her that here. Nobody knew that name here. "Who is this?" she said. A pause. Then, "Someone who got a call about 30 minutes ago from a patient at Cascade Ridge Medical Center. Someone who's been trying to locate you for about 2 years. Another pause. "You can hang up. I'll understand, but I think you should hear what I have to say." The snow hit the windshield in waves, each gust heavier than the last. Somewhere across the parking lot, the emergency exit doors opened and closed as a staff member came outside and immediately retreated back in. Nora Vance, Margaret Vance, sat in her running car in a blizzard in Montana and did not hang up. "Talk," she said. The man on the phone said his name was Calloway. No rank, no unit, no affiliation beyond that single word offered like a credential he expected her to verify on her own. She didn't ask him to explain. She just listened, watching the snow come sideways across the parking lot and the hospital lights blur and sharpen through the windshield as the defroster fought for ground. "The man they brought in tonight," Calloway said. "Hargrove. His full name is Raymond Hargrove. Retired colonel, 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 decades of service. Last 4 years in a coordinating role I'm not going to detail over the phone. He's been off-grid for 11 days. "Off-grid how?" she said. "He was driving back from a meeting in Billings and missed a check-in. His vehicle was found abandoned on a Forest Service road outside Garrison Falls 3 days ago. We've had people on the ground here since Tuesday." "What kind of meeting?" A pause. The deliberate kind. The kind where certain things get documented that certain people would prefer weren't documented. She absorbed that. "And he ended up on Route 9 in a thermal shirt. We think someone ran him off the road before the storm set in and he's been out there since. The cold slowed everything down, including whatever's bleeding internally, which is probably the only reason he's still alive." She had already worked that math. "Who called you?" "He did. About 40 minutes ago. Said a nurse had stabilized him and was fighting administration to keep the case open. Said she moved like someone who'd worked down range." A brief pause. said he recognized the hands. She almost laughed at that. Not quite. The hands. He said combat medics tape their fingers a certain way when they're working in the cold. Keeps the dexterity. He said he'd only seen it done that way in theater. She looked at her right hand on the steering wheel. The tape was still there. 2 strips across the second and third knuckles of her right hand, the way her first senior medic had shown her at Fort Carson 11 years ago. She'd done it so long, it was automatic. She didn't even think about it anymore. "Who are you, Calloway?" she said. "Specifically." "Someone who's been trying to locate you since you left the Army. Someone who has a file on you that's about 3 inches thick and mostly classified." Another pause. "Someone who needs you to go back inside that hospital." "I was suspended." "I know. Pollock filed the paperwork about 20 minutes ago." "I know, because we've had a soft monitor on Cascade Ridge since we found Hargrove's vehicle. He's been moving fast." "Pollock." "Yes." She thought about Pollock standing at the exit doors. "I know exactly what I did." The particular confidence of a man who had done this before and gotten away with it. "What do you know about him?" she said. "Enough that it's not a coincidence he came in tonight. Enough that I'd rather tell you in person." He paused. "There's a vehicle coming to your position. 10 minutes. The driver will identify himself. I need you to make a decision about whether you're willing to hear the rest of this before then." She sat with it. The heat was full now, the car warm, the contrast with the parking lot outside almost surreal. Through the glass, she could see the ER entrance, the light above it, one nurse coming outside to look at her phone and going back in quickly. Hargrove had looked at her and said, "You're the real thing." She didn't know if that was a compliment or a sentence. 10 minutes, she said, and ended the call. The vehicle was a dark green pickup, civilian plates, Montana registration. It pulled in beside her at 12:53, and the driver was a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym. She rapped twice on Nora's passenger window. Nora unlocked the door. The woman got in, brushed snow off her sleeve, and held out an ID wallet. The identification inside was federal, a specific federal designation that Nora had seen only a handful of times, and which told her the situation was considerably larger than a retired colonel in a trauma bay. "Sergeant Vance," the woman said. "It's just Vance now." "Fair enough." She put the wallet away. "My name is Diane Rourke. I'm with a federal medical oversight task force that I'll give you the full brief on when we're somewhere warmer." Short version. Raymond Hargrove was carrying documentation when he disappeared. Physical documentation, a drive and a set of printed records, relating to billing and patient outcome fraud at multiple rural medical facilities in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Cascade Ridge Medical Center is on the list. Nora went still. "Pollock." Pollock has been systematically altering patient outcome records for 4 years. Delayed treatments that weren't delayed on paper. Denials of care coded as patient refusals. Expense reports showing equipment that doesn't exist. He's good at it, the kind of good that takes practice. Rourke looked at the hospital through the windshield. Hargrove had the documentation because he'd been the one collecting it. He worked with an oversight committee that had been building the case quietly. The meeting in Billings 11 days ago was the final review before federal referral. "Someone knew he was going," Nora said. "Someone knew. We don't know who the leak is yet. We know the vehicle that ran him off the road was a black SUV registered to a shell company with ties to a healthcare management group that Pollock has financial connections to." Rourke's tone was even, factual. The way people talk when they've been holding a complicated brief together for a long time and have learned not to let the weight of it show. When Hargrove called tonight and said he'd been treated by a nurse who'd been suspended mid-shift for refusing to follow Pollock's instructions on his case, we moved up the timeline. "What timeline?" "We have a federal warrant. We were going to execute it at the hospital in the morning. Weather conditions, controlled approach. But Hargrove's medical situation and the fact that Pollock is in the building and clearly escalating changes the calculus." Nora looked at her. "You're telling me this because you need something." "I'm telling you this because Hargrove asked for you specifically, and because you have skills we need inside that building tonight." Rourke turned to face her directly. His condition is going to deteriorate. Maybe not in the next hour, maybe in the next 20 minutes. Dolan is a competent surgeon, but he doesn't know this patient, and the nurse Pollock left covering that case is 3 years out of school and has never managed a splenic laceration on surgical standby. If Hargrove drops while we're still in the parking lot sorting jurisdictions, the evidence he was carrying disappears, the case disappears, and Pollock walks. The documentation, what happened to it? It wasn't on him when he was found. We think he moved it before the vehicle was run off the road. We think he knew it was coming. Rourke paused. He hasn't told us where it is. He hasn't told anyone. But he asked for you. The snow was heavier now. The hospital entrance lights were ringed with ice crystal halos. Somewhere behind the building, a generator unit was cycling on with a low mechanical thud she could feel more than hear. I don't have a badge, Nora said. We have federal authority to reinstate your access pending the oversight response. Pollock can file whatever he wants. It's not going to hold up past tonight. Rourke reached into her jacket pocket and set a laminated temporary credential on the dashboard. This gets you through the door. What you do after that is clinical judgment, which is yours. Nora looked at the credential. Then she looked at the hospital. She thought about Hargrove's BP at 88/60, the pocket of free fluid, the grade of the laceration. She thought about the way his color had looked under the fluorescent lights, the specific gray that she associated with a body working too hard to compensate. She thought about a mountain in a country she still didn't name. 8 men, 16 hours, the one she'd been 90 seconds too late for. She picked up the credential. Tell me about Pollock's access to the floor, she said, and tell me what Dolan knows. She went in through the administrative entrance because the emergency entrance was where Pollock had last seen her, and because the administrative entrance had a keypad she still knew the code for, a detail Pollock hadn't thought to change in the 90 minutes since her suspension, which told her something about how confident he was that she was gone for good. The hallway past the administrative entrance ran parallel to the main corridor and connected to the surgical prep area through a utility junction. She knew this building's bones. 3 years of overnight shifts gave you that, especially if you were the kind of person who paid attention to the way spaces were structured. She used the temporary credential at the junction door. It worked. The surgical prep area was quiet. One tech at the far end, running an autoclave. He looked up, registered a nurse in scrubs with a credential visible, and looked back down. She walked through. The trauma bay was at the end of the east corridor. She could see the monitor light from 30 feet away, the particular blue-green glow of an active patient display. She pushed through the bay door, and Priya looked up from the medication chart, and her expression went through surprise, relief, and anxiety in roughly that sequence. Vance, how is he? Stable, barely. Priya's voice was quiet, fast. His pressure dropped again about 15 minutes ago. Dolan adjusted the fluid rate and it came back up, but it's been hovering. Dolan's in the scrub room prepping for standby, but he keeps checking back. Has he said anything? Hargrove? A little. He keeps asking about you. She paused. And he keeps asking about a bag. A bag. He says it twice and then stops. I don't know if he's confused from the blood loss or he's not confused. Nora moved to the bedside. She checked the IV lines, the monitor, the fluid bag. She'd been out of this room for less than 2 hours, but she ran the full check anyway because that was the habit. And the habit was the thing that kept people alive. Everything Dolan had ordered was correct. The fluid rate was aggressive but appropriate. The O2 was dialed right. Hargrove's eyes opened when she touched his wrist. He looked at her with an expression that was neither surprised nor relieved, more like something settling into place. You came back, he said. Apparently. She adjusted his pulse ox. You asked about a bag. A pause. His eyes moved to Priya. Nora glanced at Priya. Can you check on the saline inventory? I put in a request earlier that probably didn't get processed. Priya understood the dismissal for what it was and went. Hargrove waited until the door closed. Black bag, he said, waterproof. I hid it before they ran me off the road. I knew they would. I'd been followed from Billings. He stopped and breathed carefully. Route 9 north, mile marker 41. There's a culvert on the east shoulder. I put it there. Rourke knows? His expression shifted slightly. You talked to Calloway and Rourke in the parking lot. He was quiet for a moment, working something out. How much did they tell you? Enough. Pollock's been falsifying records for 4 years. You had the documentation. Someone knew about your meeting. The leak is inside the oversight committee, he said, not Rourke's team. The committee that hired me. One of 3 people, and I don't know which one yet. He looked at the ceiling. The drive in the bag has everything. 4 years of altered records, cross-referenced with patient outcomes, with death certificates, with billing submissions to Medicare and Medicaid. It's complete. It just needs to reach the right hands without going through the committee first. Rourke's team is clean. That's why Calloway read you in. You're outside the structure. Nobody's compromised your line. His eyes came back to her. I need you to tell Rourke about the culvert, not Calloway. Rourke specifically. Why not Calloway? He looked at her with an expression that was very tired and very certain. Because Calloway is one of the 3. The monitor beeped. Not an alarm, a routine interval pulse check. The sound was almost ordinary given what he'd just said. Nora kept her face level. You're sure? I've been sure for 6 days. I couldn't flag it through official channels without tipping him off. He paused for breath. He was in the parking lot when I called. I could hear the hospital PA in his background. He was already here before my call, which means he knew where I was before he told you he did. She ran it back. Calloway had said his team found Hargrove's vehicle 3 days ago. He'd said they'd had people on the ground since Tuesday. But he'd also said Hargrove's call tonight was how they'd located the hospital. The timeline didn't fit if Calloway had been in the parking lot during the call. Small crack. But it was there. All right, she said. Tell me you'll tell Rourke. I'll tell Rourke. He exhaled. Some of the tension in his shoulders, the held quality she'd noticed when he came in, that she'd read as pain and now understood was something else, was a man carrying information he didn't know who to trust with, came down slightly. Not gone. Just redistributed. There's one more thing, he said. There usually is. The nurse they suspended tonight for refusing to leave my case. He looked at her steadily. That's the story that gets told, whatever happens with Pollock. Not the federal angle. That'll take months to resolve. The immediate story is a hospital director throwing a nurse out into a blizzard for trying to save a patient's life. That gets out tonight. It changes what Pollock can do in the next 12 hours. She shook her head slightly. I'm not interested in being a story. I know you're not. I'm not asking you to like it. His voice was quiet and direct. I'm asking you to let it be true. Because it is true. And because Pollock has done this before. To nurses, to orderlies, to anyone who pushed back. And they didn't have anyone making noise about it afterward. They just disappeared out of the system quietly, and he kept going. A pause. You're harder to make disappear than they were. She didn't answer that. His monitor ticked steadily. His BP was holding. Barely, but holding. The door opened and Dolan came back from the scrub room, saw Nora, and stopped. Vance! He looked at her credential. What's? Federal oversight situation, she said. I'll explain in 2 minutes. First, what's his surgical threshold right now? Exactly. Dolan took 2 seconds to recalibrate, then went clinical because he was a surgeon and surgeons shifted gears when the situation required it. If his pressure drops below 80 systolic and doesn't respond to fluid bolus, we open. The laceration's at the high end of grade 3. It could go either way. Right now he's compensating, but it's fragile. Okay, she thought for a moment. I want a second large bore IV, and I want blood typed and crossed for 2 units waiting. If he drops, I don't want to be waiting on blood. I ordered type and cross when I came in. Is the blood physically ready and waiting? A pause. I'll confirm. Please. She turned back to Hargrove. Rest now. Don't talk. You need to go tell Rourke, he said. I need to make sure you don't bleed out first. Then I'll go tell Rourke. He looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't have the energy, which was probably the only reason he didn't. She found Rourke in the administrative corridor at 1:17 in the morning, which told her Rourke had already moved inside the building through a channel that didn't require Nora's temporary credential. The federal warrant was moving faster than Rourke had suggested in the parking lot. Nora pulled her into the utility junction, the same door she'd used coming in, and kept her voice low and told her what Hargrove had said about Calloway, about the timeline, about the background PA, about the three names. Rourke listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes did. A specific quality of attention that sharpened without any visible tell. When Nora finished, Rourke was quiet for 4 seconds. "Where's the documentation?" she said. Nora told her. Rourke took out her phone, typed briefly, and put it away. "I need you to go back to the patient. Don't engage with Calloway if he comes inside. Don't confirm or deny anything about the conversation you just had with me." "Where's Calloway right now?" "Parking lot, running coordination." A pause. "I thought he looked for you too fast when Hargrove called. I didn't have a mechanism for it." She looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite gratitude, something more complicated than that, more operational. "You gave me the mechanism." "Hargrove gave you the mechanism. I'm just the relay." The relay who walked back into a hospital she'd been suspended from in a blizzard at 1 in the morning. Rourke almost smiled, not quite. "Go check on your patient." Nora went. Us. The next 40 minutes were the particular kind of tense that doesn't announce itself. Not the spiking, adrenaline-colored tension of an acute crisis, but the sustained low hum of a situation that could go wrong in any of 3 directions simultaneously and required the kind of attention that ate through you slowly. Hargrove's BP held at 86 systolic. Not good. Not actively crashing. The blood was ready. Dolan was in the bay, positioned. Nora managed the fluid rate with the kind of granular precision that Dolan watched twice and then stopped questioning because he was smart enough to recognize the difference between textbook adequate and something else. At 1:40, Priya came to the bay door and said very quietly that Pollock was on the floor. "Doing what?" Nora said without looking up from the monitor. "Walking. Talking to the overnight admin. I think he's trying to figure out how you got back in." "Let him figure. He looks angry." "He can be angry outside this room." Priya hesitated in the doorway. She was young, 26, maybe 27, and she had the look of someone who understood that something larger than a personnel dispute was happening and was trying to decide what her position in it was. "What's actually going on?" she said. Nora looked at her. She thought about what Hargrove had said. They just disappeared out of the system quietly, and he kept going. She thought about the staff at the nursing station who had found things to look at on their screens when Pollock delivered the suspension notice. "You're a good nurse," she said. "You know this patient's baseline better than anyone on the floor right now except me. If something happens in the next hour, I need you in this room focused, not in the hallway watching Pollock." She paused. "So, stay close." Priya nodded, came in and took her position on the other side of the bay. At 2:04, the monitor alarmed, not the routine interval beep. The sustained, escalating tone that meant the number on the pressure display had just dropped below the threshold Dolan had named. 78 systolic, 75. "Bolus," Nora said, already moving. Dolan was at the bedside in under 3 seconds, which was good. He called for the OR. Nora pushed the fluid, watched the number, called the vitals to Dolan in a steady sequence. Hargrove's eyes opened. Wide, slightly confused, the look of someone whose body has just told them something urgent without translating it into language. "You're okay," she said to him. Not reassurance, information, delivered flat and direct so he'd believe it. "We're taking you to surgery. It's going to be loud and bright and then you'll be under. You don't have to do anything except keep breathing." His hand moved, found her wrist. "The bag," he said. "Did she—" "Handled," she said. "Keep breathing." The pressure ticked up slightly. 79, 81. The bolus was buying time, not solving the problem. "We need to move," Dolan said. They moved. The gurney came through the bay door at speed. Nora on one side, Dolan on the other, Priya managing the IV lines. The corridor lights went overhead in that particular fast sequence of surgical transport, the kind of movement that changes the air pressure in a hallway. They came around the corner toward the elevator bank and Pollock was there. He was standing in the corridor with Ferris and a man Nora didn't recognize, older, in a suit that wasn't hospital administration, The kind of man who looked like he'd arrived with his own agenda and Pollock's crisis as a vehicle for it. Pollock saw the gurney, saw Nora. His expression went through something complicated in about half a second. He stepped into the corridor. "Stop," he said. "This patient." "Surgical emergency," Dolan said, not stopping. "Move." "This patient's treatment authorization is under administrative review. I'm the attending surgeon, and I'm telling you he's going to die if you don't move." Pollock didn't move. Nora looked at him. She was pushing a gurney with a man on it who had a grade 3 splenic laceration and a BP of 81 and a federal warrant in the building with his name on it, and the man standing in the corridor thought this moment was one he could win. "Pollock," she said, "last chance." Something in her voice that, not volume, not anger, just a specific quality of certainty that came from having stood in far worse places and made far harder calls, reached him. He stepped aside. The gurney went through. She didn't look back, but she heard the man in the suit say something to Pollock in a low voice, and she heard Pollock's response. Short, clipped, the sound of someone who has just realized the ground has shifted under them without being able to identify exactly when it happened. The elevator doors opened. The gurney went in. Dolan looked at her over Hargrove's body. "You want to scrub in?" he said. It wasn't a standard offer. It wasn't even strictly a medical one. It was one professional recognizing another. "Yes," she said. The doors closed. In her coat pocket, her phone buzzed once. A text from an unknown number. Different from Calloway's. Different from anyone she'd been in contact with tonight. 6 words. Culvert confirmed. Drive secured. We have him. She stared at it as the elevator rose toward the surgical floor. Below them, somewhere in the corridor they'd just left, Pollock was still standing with the man in the suit. She didn't know what was being said. She didn't know how much time Pollock thought he had left, but she knew something he didn't. The evidence that could end him was no longer in a culvert on Route 9. It was already in federal hands, and the night wasn't close to finished. The surgery took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Nora stood across the table from Dolan and did what she had not done in 3 years. She worked in the specific, focused silence of an operating environment, handing, tracking, anticipating the next move before it was called. Dolan was good, better than she'd initially read him. He worked clean, and he didn't narrate unnecessarily, and when the laceration turned out to be higher grade than imaging had suggested, a full grade 4, with a secondary tear along the inferior pole that the pre-op scan had missed, he didn't panic. He adapted. She adapted with him. The spleen came out at 3:08 a.m. Not the outcome anyone had wanted, but Hargrove's pressure had dropped to 62 on the table when Dolan found the secondary tear, and at that point the math changed. Repair was no longer the calculation. Survival was. When Dolan closed, Hargrove's BP was back at 94. Not good, acceptable. The difference between those two things was the entire width of the night. "Good call on the second line," Dolan said, pulling off his gloves. "If we'd been waiting on blood when the pressure dropped—" "We weren't," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not the look of a superior assessing a subordinate, something more level than that. "No," he said, "we weren't." She went to scrub out. The OR sink was cold. The hot water on this side of the building had been inconsistent for months, another thing nobody had fixed. And she stood there in the thin, cold water and felt the particular crash that comes after sustained focus releases its grip. Not exhaustion exactly, more like gravity reasserting itself. It was 3:19 in the morning. She had been awake for 21 hours. She dried her hands and went back out. Won't. The surgical floor waiting area was empty except for Rourke, who was sitting in a chair near the window with a tablet in her lap and a coffee cup that appeared to have been there long enough to go cold. She looked up when Nora came through the door, and her expression asked the question before she did. "He's out," Nora said. "Splenectomy. He's stable." Rourke exhaled, a controlled, quiet sound, but real. Recovery timeline. 4 to 6 weeks minimum. He won't be giving testimony anywhere for at least 2. Nora sat down in the chair across from her. Her legs were registering the hours now. "What's happening downstairs?" Rourke set the tablet face down on her knee. "Calloway is in federal custody. He was detained at 1:58 when our team confirmed the timeline discrepancy you identified. He didn't resist, which tells me he knew it was coming and decided cooperation was his best play. A pause. He's been operating as an inside source for the healthcare management group for approximately 16 months. He was the one who flagged Hargrove's Billings meeting. He almost got Hargrove killed. Yes. Rourke's voice carried a specific flatness on that word, not absence of feeling, but feeling that had been processed into something operational. Pollock is still in the building. He retained a lawyer by phone at around 2:30 and has been refusing to speak to anyone since. The warrant covers the hospital's administrative records, billing systems, patient outcome files going back 4 years. Our team has been copying the servers since 1:45. The man in the suit, Nora said, in the corridor when we were moving Hargrove to surgery. Attorney. Pollock had him on call. Rourke picked up her coffee, looked at it, set it back down. He came in fast. Too fast for a private attorney responding to a middle-of-the-night call. We think he was already in Garrison Falls. Nora thought about that. Pollock knew something was coming. He knew the Oversight Committee had been building a case. He didn't know Hargrove had the documentation, and he didn't know about our team specifically. But he was operating cautiously, accelerating certain records alterations, moving financial exposure off the hospital's direct books. Rourke paused. The suspension tonight wasn't just about you challenging him on a patient intake. He moved on you that fast because you'd connected to Hargrove's case, and Hargrove was the exposure he was most worried about. Nora sat with that. She'd walked into the ER that night thinking the biggest problem was a blizzard and a saline shortage. How long before the records access gives you what you need for the charges, she said. We have enough already. The drive from the culvert has 4 years of cross-referenced data. Altered records matched to patient outcomes matched to billing submissions. 3 patients died as a direct result of delayed treatment that Pollock coded as patient-initiated refusals. 2 of them were Medicare beneficiaries, which makes it federal fraud on top of the state-level charges. Rourke's voice stayed even. The drive is the spine. The server records are the corroboration. With both, the case is closed. 3 patients. Nora let that number sit in her chest for a moment, which was all the time she allowed it. What do you need from me? She said. A statement. Everything from the intake, the suspension, Pollock's conduct, your conversation with Hargrove in the trauma bay, what he told you, what he asked you to do. It'll be part of the federal record. That's fine. And Rourke stopped. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, but enough to register as distinct from her baseline. There's a situation developing downstairs that I need to brief you on. It's why I'm up here, rather than on the administrative floor. Nora looked at her. Tell me. Pollock made some calls before his attorney arrived. We don't have the full content. He used a personal cell and we don't have a tap on it under the current warrant scope. But in the last 40 minutes, 3 members of the hospital board have shown up. At 3 a.m, in a blizzard. Rourke's expression was carefully neutral. They're meeting with Pollock's attorney in the administrative conference room right now. Nora understood what that meant. They're trying to manage it. They're trying to manage it before the federal narrative becomes the only narrative. If they can position tonight as an internal personnel matter that the hospital is self-correcting, Pollock resigning, records being voluntarily reviewed, they limit the board's exposure and potentially reduce the scope of federal oversight. Rourke paused. It won't work. The federal case is too complete. But it could buy time, complicate the timeline, create legal interference. Can they actually do that? Their attorney can file for a temporary injunction on the record's access. It'll get dismissed, but it could take 48 hours, and in 48 hours, certain things can get harder to access even with a warrant. Rourke looked at her steadily. The thing that makes that strategy fail is transparency. If what happened in this hospital tonight is on record, documented, witnessed, corroborated, before they file anything, the injunction argument collapses. A federal judge looking at documented patient endangerment doesn't grant 48-hour stays. You need the statement tonight. I need it in the next 2 hours. Nora looked at the OR door. Hargrove was on the other side of it, in a recovery room, post-splenectomy, BP holding at 94, not available to anyone for weeks. She looked at the window, the snow still coming down, the parking lot lights still blurred and haloed, the night outside unchanged and indifferent. Get me a recorder, she said. She gave the statement in the surgical floor conference room at 3:44 a.m. with a federal recorder on the table and a court reporter on a video link from somewhere that wasn't Garrison Falls. She spoke for 41 minutes. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She gave times, sequences, direct quotes where she had them, and clinical observations with the specificity that comes from training that teaches you to document what you see rather than what you interpret. At one point, the court reporter asked her to slow down. She slowed down. When she was done, Rourke reviewed the preliminary transcript on her tablet and said only, "That's enough." Nora thought about asking what happened next. She already knew the shape of it. Federal process moved the way it moved, not fast and not clean, with continuances and attorneys and the particular grinding patience of institutional accountability that almost never looked like justice from the inside and sometimes turned into it anyway. She went back to check on Hargrove. He was in recovery, still under the anesthetic tail. His monitor showed BP at 97, heart rate 68, O2 at 98. Better. Still not good, but moving in the direction of good. The recovery nurse, a man named Tate, who Nora knew from the occasional crossover shift, looked up when she came in and didn't question her presence. She stood at Hargrove's bedside and looked at his face. Without the tension of consciousness, without the calculated watchfulness, he looked older. Somewhere in his mid-60s, she guessed, though the military life compresses things in ways that made it hard to read. There were old scars on his hands and a healed fracture in his left orbital ridge that hadn't set quite right, and the particular quality of stillness in his face that she associated with people who had spent a long time being careful about what they showed. She stayed for 4 minutes. Then she went back to the floor. At 4:20, the building changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the particular background frequency of a hospital at night. Voices at a volume that didn't belong. Movement in the stairwell. The sound of the administrative floor elevator running when the administrative floor elevator had been mostly quiet for hours. She went to the east corridor and found Priya standing near the nursing station, looking at her phone with an expression Nora couldn't immediately read. "What is it?" she said. Priya held up her phone. She'd been on the hospital's internal staff communication channel, an unofficial group message thread that the overnight nursing staff used, the kind of thing administration knew about and periodically tried to shut down and never quite managed to. The message was from a nurse named Okafor on the administrative floor. 11 words. Board is trying to make Pollock a victim. Someone needs to say something. Nora looked at it. Then she looked up at Priya. "How many people are on that thread?" she said. "Maybe 60. All staff." Priya paused. "There are already responses." Nora took the phone. She read through them. 6 nurses, 2 techs, a radiology orderly, a respiratory therapist. Short messages, the kind people type when they've been holding something for a long time, and someone has finally opened the door. One nurse named Delacroix wrote, "He did this to me in 2022. I didn't say anything because I thought no one would listen." Another message, unsigned but with a staff account tag. "There are records of 3 patients who were turned away in 2021. I know because I was there and I wrote it down." Nora handed the phone back. She stood in the corridor for a moment and thought. The board meeting in the administrative conference room was a containment operation. That was the word for it. Tactical, deliberate. The kind of institutional self-preservation maneuver that worked when the only people with information were inside the room. It didn't work when the information was already moving through a 60-person staff thread at 4:20 in the morning. "Can you forward Okafor's message and the responses to this number?" she said, and gave Priya Rourke's contact. Priya typed it in, sent it. Her phone buzzed back in 40 seconds. "Rourke. 2 words. Already have it." The board meeting broke up at 5:07. Nora knew because she was in the east corridor when the elevator came down from the administrative floor and 3 people in expensive coats walked through toward the parking entrance with the particular body language of people who have just discovered their plan has more problems than they brought lawyers for. Pollock's attorney was with them, talking quietly with his head down and his hands moving in that rapid, contained way that attorneys move when they're recalibrating advice in real time. Pollock was not with them. She found out why 11 minutes later when Rourke appeared at the nursing station and said, with no particular drama. He's been formally detained. Our team is with him in the administrative conference room. A pause. The board's attorney called the federal DA at 4:52 and indicated the board would not be obstructing the records access. Whatever Pollock told them in that meeting, it didn't hold once they saw the scope of the documentation. They cut him loose, Nora said. They cut him loose. Rourke looked at the nursing station, at the monitors, at the overnight shape of the floor. The self-correction story doesn't work when 3 patients are dead and the federal case is already complete. They're lawyers and executives. They ran the numbers. Nora thought about Delacroix's message. I didn't say anything because I thought no one would listen. She thought about the unnamed staff member with the 2021 records. She thought about all the small, quiet surrenders that accumulate when a building belongs to someone who uses it as leverage. The staff who responded on that thread, she said, their statements need to be part of the federal record. We're taking them. Anyone willing to give a statement? Rourke is setting up a voluntary documentation process starting at 6 a.m. She paused. Your name is attached to the initial complaint. That's going to be public once the federal filing goes in. Nora had known that was coming. She still didn't love it. How public? Federal filings are public record. The hospital board situation will be reported locally. The suspension of a nurse during an active patient emergency during a declared weather event. That's the kind of detail that travels. Rourke looked at her steadily. Hargrove was right. It's the human story that moves fastest. I know. She looked down the corridor. The heating vent above the nursing station was still rattling, same as always. I'm not going to stop it. She paused, looking for the word. I didn't come back here for that part. I know you didn't. I came back because the patient needed a nurse who knew his case. I know that too. Rourke held her gaze. Both things can be true at the same time. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back to work. The shift change at 6 a.m. brought the day staff in with the particular weary relief of people arriving to take over a situation they hadn't been part of and were only now understanding the shape of. 2 of the incoming nurses stopped at the station and looked around at the federal personnel still moving through the administrative corridor and the evidence tape across the records room door and asked Priya what had happened. Priya told them, briefly, accurately, without embellishment. Nora was at the medication cabinet running the outgoing handoff inventory when she heard it, Priya's voice carrying the events of the night in the compact factual shorthand of someone who had been there and was still processing it herself. She didn't listen closely. She didn't need to. She knew the story. At 6:23, she finished the handoff documentation, signed the chart on Hargrove's recovery status, and collected her coat from the locker room. She was walking toward the administrative exit when she heard footsteps behind her. Fast, purposeful, not threatening. She turned. It was Okafor. The nurse from the thread, she assumed, a tall woman in her 30s with the specific look of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was running on something past caffeine. You're Vance, Okafor said. Yes. I wanted to say... She stopped, started again. I've been at this hospital for 6 years. I've watched him do this to people. I wrote down what I saw in 2022, and I never gave it to anyone because he made it clear that anyone who went outside the hospital with anything would be dealt with. And I believed him. She paused. I shouldn't have. Nora looked at her. The fluorescent light in the corridor was doing what fluorescent lights always do at 6 in the morning, making everything look slightly more worn than it actually was. You're giving a statement today, she said. Yes. That matters more than anything you didn't do in 2022. Okafor looked at her. Something in her expression released slightly. Not absolution, not even close, but acknowledgement. The difference between carrying something and carrying it alone. She nodded and went back toward the nursing floor. Nora watched her go. Then she pushed through the administrative exit into the morning. The blizzard had passed somewhere in the early hours, the way Montana storms did. Not gradually, but suddenly, like a door closing. The sky was the particular white-gray of post-storm winter, flat and cold and still. The snow in the parking lot was 18 inches deep and unmarked except for the federal vehicles and the tire tracks from the board members' cars leaving before 5. She walked to her car. The snow had drifted against the driver's door and she had to push to get it open. She sat down, started the engine. The heat came on cold and then warmer. She sat there for a moment without driving anywhere. 3 years in Garrison Falls, 3 years of quiet overnight shifts and good enough coffee, and the particular discipline of not thinking too far forward or too far back. She'd made it work. She'd been making it work. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again, but when she looked at it, it was a 719 area code. Colorado Springs. She stared at it for 2 rings. It could be nothing. It could be a lot of things. She picked up. Sergeant Vance? The voice was male, older, carrying the specific unhurried weight of very senior rank. Not Calloway. Not anyone she'd spoken to tonight. Who is this? She said. Same question as always. Different night. General Warren Shea, Army Surgeon General's office. I apologize for the hour. A pause that was not apologetic in the slightest. I've been briefed on tonight's situation at Cascade Ridge. Colonel Hargrove has been on our personnel radar since his oversight work began. When we learned what happened tonight, the circumstances of your involvement, I wanted to make contact personally. She said nothing. Your service record is something we discuss in certain contexts, Shea said. The operation that ended your tour, the outcomes, what you did, and what it cost you. Another pause. I understand you've been practicing under a civilian designation. I understand why. I'm not calling to complicate that. Then why are you calling, General? A brief silence on the line, the kind that means someone is choosing their words because the words matter. Because what happened tonight is going to become a record, he said. A federal record, a public record eventually, a record with your name on it. And when that record exists, I want there to be a corresponding record on our end that accurately reflects what you are. He paused. What you were. What you've always been. She looked through the windshield at the hospital. The lights were all still on. A federal vehicle was parked near the administrative entrance. Above the roofline, the sky was getting lighter in the east. Not sunrise yet, but the first suggestion of it, the darkness thinning rather than breaking. I'm a nurse, she said. You're a lot of things. He let that sit. I'd like to have a conversation. Not now, when you've slept and Colonel Hargrove is stable and the federal process has moved forward. A few days. I'll come to you if that's easier. She thought about Hargrove on the recovery room table with his post-surgical vitals and his old orbital scar and the specific stillness of a man who had spent a career moving carefully through dangerous situations and had almost not made it through this one. She thought about Delacroix's message and Okafor's face in the corridor and the 3 patients in the federal file who had died because someone decided paperwork and profit margins were a reasonable substitution for treatment. She thought about a mountain and 16 hours and 8 men and the one she hadn't been fast enough for. I'll hear what you have to say, she said. That's all I'm asking. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and the engine running and the heat finally coming through the vents in earnest. Then her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized. The Cascade Ridge internal line, the main nursing floor desk. She picked up. Priya's voice. Too fast. Too tight. Vance, I need you back inside. A pause. Right now. What happened? Recovery called. Hargrove's monitor alarmed at 6:40. They went in and his BP has crashed. They're saying 58 systolic and dropping. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. Dolan's not responding to pages. His phone is going to voicemail, and nobody knows where he is. Nora was already getting out of the car. I'm coming, she said. Tell recovery to start a fluid bolus, open the IV wide, get the crash cart to the room. And keep paging Dolan every 30 seconds until he answers. What if he doesn't? He will. But if he doesn't, I need to know who the next surgical attending on call is and whether they can get here in under 10 minutes. Vance, I'm walking in the door right now. She pushed through the administrative entrance, the cold air following her inside, the corridor lights hitting her after the gray-white of the parking lot. Stay on the line. Tell me his heart rate. 130, 132. It's climbing. She ran. The elevator was too slow. She hit the stairwell, took the stairs at a pace that was not quite running but was faster than anyone in scrubs usually moved through a hospital stairwell, and came through the surgical floor door into the recovery corridor at a pace that made the desk nurse look up sharply. She went straight to the room. Hargrove's monitor was screaming. The recovery nurse, Tate, same one from earlier, looking like he'd aged 4 years in 40 minutes, had the fluid running wide and was on the phone. The BP display read 54/32. Heart rate 138 and climbing. She looked at Hargrove's abdomen under the surgical dressing, looked at the drain output, looked at the color of the drain. Red, bright red, too bright, too much. "He's rebleeding," she said. Tate said, "The repair didn't hold or there's a secondary vessel." She was already pulling on gloves. "Where's Dolan?" Still no answer. "Who's the backup surgical attending?" "Dr. Stein. Get her on the phone right now. Tell her post-splenectomy patient, post-op hemorrhage, BP in the 50s. She needs to be here in 7 minutes." She looked at Tate. "Do you have ONEG in recovery?" 2 units. "Hang both, right now." He moved. She moved with him. The monitor kept screaming. She got the second IV running and started the first unit of blood and looked at Hargrove's face. Still unconscious, still under the anesthetic tail, his body doing its worst work entirely without him. "You're the real thing, whatever you're doing here." She put her hand on his wrist. Pulse thready, rapid, too rapid. "Stay with me, Hargrove," she said quietly. Not reassurance, not a request. An instruction, delivered in the tone she'd used on a mountain 11 years ago when she'd needed 8 men to hold on through things she couldn't fix fast enough. Some of them had listened. She needed this one to listen now. The recovery room door opened behind her and she turned, expecting Stein, expecting Dolan, expecting anyone with surgical authority. Instead, it was Rourke. Her expression was not the controlled operational neutral of the past several hours. Something had cracked in it. Not panic, but its functional cousin. "Vance," she said, "we have a problem that's not medical." Nora looked at her, then at the monitor, then back at Rourke. "Whatever it is," she said, "it's going to wait 3 minutes." "It can't wait 3 minutes." Rourke stepped fully into the room and lowered her voice below the alarm noise. "Pollock got out." Nora stilled. His attorney filed an emergency motion at 6:15. A county judge, local, not federal, granted a temporary release pending a jurisdiction hearing. "Our team is contesting it, but it's going to take at least an hour to resolve through the federal channel." Rourke's voice was taut and even. He left the administrative conference room at 6:38 with his attorney. "We had him under informal custody. We didn't have the formal detention papers yet because the federal warrant is arrest authorized, but the local jurisdiction complication—" "Where is he now?" Nora said. "We don't know." The monitor screamed. The blood pressure display ticked down. Nora turned back to Hargrove. "He's the only witness who can directly corroborate the chain of evidence custody," Rourke said behind her. "If Pollock reaches him before we do—" "Pollock can't reach him," Nora said. "He's in post-op hemorrhage. Nobody's reaching him." "Vance, I know what you're telling me." She adjusted the blood flow, checked the line, watched the monitor. "I know what it means, and right now the only thing between Hargrove and whatever happens next is whether he survives the next 10 minutes. She turned just enough to look at Rourke over her shoulder. "So find Pollock. That's your job. This is mine." Rourke looked at her for one long second. Then she turned and went back through the door. The monitor alarm shifted pitch, still bad, but differently bad. The first unit of blood was running. The BP display ticked, 56, 59. The recovery room door opened again. This time it was a woman in surgical scrubs, hair half-pinned, moving with the particular fast-controlled energy of a surgeon who'd been woken up and had transitioned to clinical mode before she was fully awake. Dr. Stein. She looked at the monitor, looked at the drain, looked at Nora. "Talk to me," she said. "Post-splenectomy, 6 hours out. Rebleeding from a suspected secondary vessel. BP was in the 50s, coming up marginally on 2 units O-neg. Drain output is bright red, high volume. He needs to go back in." Stein looked at the drain, looked at the monitor, made the calculation in about 4 seconds. "R2 is still set up from last night," she said. "Let's go." And somewhere in the building below them, past the federal personnel and the evidence tape and the locked administrative conference room where a county judge's emergency order had just changed everything. Warren Pollock was no longer where anyone could find him. The second surgery took an hour and 40 minutes. Stein found the bleed 6 minutes in. A small arterial branch near the surgical bed where the spleen had been missed in the first operation not through negligence, but through the simple physical fact that the first surgery had been managing a crisis, and crisis management leaves edges. The vessel had held through the night and let go sometime around 6 a.m., which was the kind of thing that happened, and the kind of thing that nobody could entirely predict, and the kind of thing that killed people when nobody was paying attention. Nora had been paying attention. She stood across the table from Stein and did what she'd done 4 hours earlier with Dolan. Tracked, anticipated, managed the numbers. Stein worked differently than Dolan. Faster, less verbal, with a precision that came from a decade of solo rural surgical practice where you didn't have backup and you didn't have the luxury of calling a colleague for a second opinion. She cauterized the vessel, checked the surgical bed twice, checked it a third time, and closed. Hargrove's BP at closure was 88 systolic. Better than the first surgery. Worse than anyone wanted. Enough. When Stein stepped back from the table, she pulled off one glove and pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her forehead. A small, private gesture. The kind that leaks out when you've been running on adrenaline and the pressure drops. "He's going to be in recovery for a long time," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "Is someone going to tell me what's actually happening in this building?" Nora looked at her across the surgical field. Stein was 50, maybe 52, with the specific no-nonsense quality of someone who had spent her career being the only surgeon in the room and had stopped waiting for explanations that came in the right order. "Federal fraud investigation," Nora said. "Pollock's been falsifying patient records for 4 years. 3 deaths attributable. The patient on your table was carrying the documentation." Stein was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you?" "Overnight nurse. I was suspended for refusing to leave his case." Stein looked at her with an expression that was several things at once. She pulled off the second glove. "Who suspended you?" she said. "Pollock." "Then it doesn't count." She turned toward the scrub sink. "Welcome back." Damn. It was 7:41 when Nora came out of the OR. The surgical floor had a different quality than it had 2 hours ago. More people, more movement. The particular shift that happens in a building when something that's been contained overnight starts becoming the day's news. 2 federal agents were at the nurse's station going through a printed log with the charge nurse. A woman with a press lanyard was in the lobby 1 floor down. Nora had seen her through the stairwell window, which meant the story had already reached at least 1 local outlet. Rourke was in the corridor off a phone call, moving toward her. "He's stable," Nora said before Rourke could ask. "Good." Rourke fell into step beside her. Pollock's attorney called the county DA at 7:15. He's trying to negotiate a voluntary surrender framing. His client came forward, cooperated. The federal detention was procedurally improper given the jurisdiction question. "Is that going to work?" "No, but it's going to take until late morning to formalize the federal override, which is time Pollock's team is using." She paused. "We found his location 20 minutes ago. He's at the Garrison Falls Doubletree, the one on Commerce near the highway. He checked in at 7:02 under his attorney's name." "You have people there?" "We have people outside. The formal detention order comes through the federal channel and the county DA has to honor it. That's settled. It's just paperwork and it's moving. We'll have him in custody before 9. She paused in a way that had content behind it. "There's something else." Nora stopped walking. "The staff communication thread," Rourke said. "The one that went active overnight. By 6 a.m. It had been screenshotted and posted to 3 different local social media accounts. By 7, it had been picked up by a regional news aggregator in Billings. She looked at Nora steadily. "The version that's moving has your name in it. The suspension, the patient, the blizzard. It's specific." "Who posted it?" "Multiple people. It wasn't coordinated. Bus it. It was just several staff members who'd been holding things for a long time and had their phones out." A pause. "I can't tell you that's bad for the federal case. It isn't. But I want you to know it's happening before you walk into the lobby." Nora stood in the corridor and thought about that. She'd told Hargrove she didn't want to be a story. She'd meant it. She still meant it, meaning it didn't change what was already moving. "Is the federal filing in?" she said. "Formal charges filed at 7:22. Hargrove's testimony will be taken when he's medically cleared. Weeks out, as you said. Your statement and the drive documentation are the primary evidentiary record." Rourke paused. "The 3 patient deaths are in the charging document by name. Their families are being notified this morning." 3 names in a federal document. It was not justice. It was the beginning of the process that might become justice, which was a different and slower thing. But it was real. It was on record. "The staff who gave statements overnight," Nora said, "make sure they have contact information for federal victim witness support. Some of them have been sitting on what they saw for years. That doesn't just go away because the case is filed. Already in process." Rourke looked at her. "You've been awake for how long?" "Long enough. You should go home." "I know." She didn't move immediately. "Let me check on recovery first." Hargrove was back in the recovery room by 8:15, BP holding at 91, heart rate steadying into the 60s. Tate was on recovery duty again, looking like a man who had experienced a great deal in a short period and was quietly deciding how he felt about it. Nora stood at the bedside for 5 minutes. She checked the drain. Output was minimal now, and the color had shifted from bright arterial red to the darker, slower seep that meant the bleed was controlled. She checked the lines. She looked at his face. He was still under. He would be for hours. He didn't know what the morning had become. She wrote her cell number on a piece of tape and stuck it to his chart. She told Tate to call her when he came around, if she wasn't already back in the building. Tate said he would. She went to the locker room, got her coat and bag for the second time that morning, and walked toward the exit. This time nobody stopped her in the corridor. She got to the administrative entrance and pushed through and stood in the cold. The sky had shifted while she'd been in surgery. The flat white gray of post-storm had started breaking up, pale blue showing through in patches above the tree line to the east. The parking lot was deep in snow, and the federal vehicles had made ruts that were already beginning to freeze at the edges. Her car was where she'd left it. She got in, started it, turned the heat on. She sat there and let herself be tired for the first time since the night before. It was a specific kind of tired, not just sleep deprivation, though that was real and physical and sitting in her joints and behind her eyes. It was the kind of tired that comes from holding something at a sustained level of attention for hours and then setting it down and feeling the weight of what you'd been carrying. She was familiar with it. She'd carried it off a mountain 11 years ago, and she'd been carrying a quieter version of it for 3 years in Garrison Falls, and she didn't know what it would feel like to set it down completely. Maybe that wasn't something that happened. Maybe it was just something you learned to carry better. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Local area code, different from anything she'd seen overnight. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Is this Nora Vance?" A woman's voice. Young, professional, controlled. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Sasha Orlin. I'm a reporter with the Garrison Falls Courier. I'm calling about the events at Cascade Ridge Medical Center last night. I understand you were directly involved." Nora looked at the hospital through the windshield. "I'm not doing interviews," she said. "I understand. I'm not looking for a formal statement. I wanted to make sure you knew that the story is already running. We published at 7:50 this morning. The federal filing is public record. The staff communications that were shared publicly overnight are cited. Your name is in it." "I figured. I also wanted you to know—" A brief pause. The kind that means someone is deciding whether to say something off record. "I covered Cascade Ridge 2 years ago. A story about ER wait times that Pollock's communications office pushed back on aggressively. They threatened to pull advertising from our parent publication. The story got significantly edited." Another pause. "I never forgot the patients in it. This time it's going in complete." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said, and ended the call. She got 3 hours of sleep. It wasn't enough, and it would have to be. She set her alarm for 11, and when it went off, she sat up in the cold of her apartment. The radiator on the south wall ran inconsistently, another maintenance issue she'd been meaning to deal with. and drank water and took stock of the situation with the particular forced function clarity of someone who has operated past the edges of their capacity and is now running on something thinner and less reliable than actual alertness. Her phone had 17 missed calls, 5 from numbers she didn't recognize, 2 from the hospital's main line, 1 from Rourke, 1 from a 202 area code she associated with nothing good, and the rest from local numbers that were probably press. She called Rourke back first. Pollack was taken into federal custody at 9:47, Rourke said without preamble. The county DA honored the federal detention order. No further legal interference from the local channel. The board's attorney withdrew the injunction motion at 8:30. A pause. He's being held without bail pending the initial federal appearance. The DA cited flight risk and evidence tampering potential. Good. The hospital board issued a statement at 10 a.m. Pollack has been removed from his position effective immediately. The board is, quote, fully cooperating with the federal investigation and deeply committed to patient safety, end quote. Rourke's tone was dry in a way that was the closest she'd come to editorial comment all night. Standard language. And the 3 patients. Their families have been notified. 2 of them have already been contacted by attorneys. Civil suits will follow the criminal proceedings. Rourke paused. One family, a woman named Dolores Marsh, her husband was one of the patients who died in 2021. She called the hospital this morning. She'd been told he died from natural progression of his condition. She spent 2 years believing that. A beat. She didn't cry on the call. She just said she needed to know it was real. Nora pressed her hand briefly to her forehead. The apartment was cold. The radiator ticked without producing heat. What about Calloway? She said. He's cooperating fully. He's given the identity of his contact within the healthcare management group and provided communication records going back 16 months. The group's Montana operations are under a separate warrant as of this morning. A pause. He'll likely receive reduced charges in exchange for the cooperation. I want you to know that before you read it somewhere else. She absorbed that. Calloway had handed Hargrove to people who'd tried to kill him. Cooperation agreements were not justice, they were utility, and the federal system used them because they were efficient, and she had long since stopped expecting the 2 things to be the same. Is there anything you still need from me today? She said. No. You've given everything we need. Rest. A pause that was almost human. You should know, Dr. Stein formally documented the overnight clinical events in Hargrove's medical record this morning. The record states that the patient's survival of the initial presentation and both surgical interventions was directly supported by nursing assessment and intervention by Nora Vance, including identification of internal hemorrhage on intake, refusal to abandon care during unauthorized suspension, and early identification of post-operative rebleed. Another pause. It's in the permanent medical record. It's specific. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Stein didn't have to do that, she said. No, Rourke agreed. She didn't. Yeah. She went back to the hospital at 2 in the afternoon, not because anyone had called her in, but because Tate had texted at 1:47, patient awake and asking for you. Seems annoyed you're not here. She'd almost smiled at that. The recovery floor was quieter than it had been. The federal personnel were mostly in the administrative wing now, working through the records access with the methodical pace of people who had a complete case and were building its architecture for trial. The press presence outside had grown. She'd counted 4 vehicles in the lot with equipment on the way in, but the clinical floors were functioning with the specific determined normalcy of hospital staff who had decided that whatever was happening in administration, the patient still needed nursing. She appreciated that more than she could have said. Hargrove was in a step-down room, off recovery, elevated slightly, O2 down to nasal cannula, color better than it had been in any of the preceding 16 hours. He looked, in the particular honest light of a winter afternoon coming through a small window, like a man who had been through 2 surgeries in one night and was trying not to show how much it cost him. He was doing about 60% on that. You look terrible, she said. I've looked worse. He shifted slightly against the pillow and stopped, which told her the pain management was adequate but not generous. I heard there was a second surgery. There was. And I'm alive. Observably. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. The calculation was still there, muted now by medication and exhaustion, but present. It was probably just how he looked at things. Some people never turned it off. Rourke told me about Calloway, he said. I figured she would. I should have flagged it sooner. I kept thinking I needed more certainty before I moved on someone in that position. He paused. That's a habit that almost got me killed. It did almost get you killed. Yes. He said it flatly, without self-pity, which she respected. And you came back into the building twice to keep me from dying, which is something I'm going to spend some time thinking about. Don't spend too much time on it. You'd have done the same. Probably. He looked at the window. The sky outside had gone full blue by mid-afternoon, the post-storm clarity that turned Montana into something that looked almost unreasonably beautiful. Pollock's in custody. Since this morning. The documentation is with Rourke's team. It is. Then it's done. He said it quietly, with the tone of someone setting something down that they've been carrying at considerable personal cost. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the particular stillness of a weight released. Or done enough. The rest is lawyers. The rest is always lawyers. He almost smiled. It looked like it hurt. Shay called you. She looked at him. You knew he would. I told him to, before the surgery. He paused. You should hear what he has to say. I told him I'd listen. Good. He turned his head on the pillow to look at her more directly. You've been doing this for 3 years. Overnight shifts in a place like this. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, because it does. You know it does. But you've been doing it at about 30% of your capacity. That was the point, she said. I know what the point was. He held her gaze. I know what you're carrying from the mountain. I know who you couldn't save. He paused. I also know the names of the 7 who came home. I've met most of them. Another pause. You should know they talk about you. She looked at the window, the blue sky, the tree line. She'd spent 3 years not thinking about the 7. It was easier to carry the one she'd lost than to think about the 7 she hadn't, because the 7 required her to believe something about herself that she hadn't been able to sustain. I know, she said, quieter than she meant it. Shay isn't calling about a medal or a ceremony or anything that requires you to perform something you don't feel, Hargrove said. He's calling about a program, a training program for rural medical facilities in high-risk response situations, civilian and military partnership. The model is basically what you did last night. The intersection of tactical medical response and civilian emergency care. He paused. He needs someone who can do both, someone who's actually done both. She was quiet. I'm not telling you what to decide, he said. I'm just making sure you have the information. Hargrove. What? Rest, she said. You had 2 surgeries. He settled back against the pillow with the look of a man accepting a tactical retreat. She checked his lines, his drain, his monitor, everything holding. She wrote an updated note in his chart and flagged the pain management for the evening attending to review. The current dosing was on the cautious side, and he'd need it adjusted before overnight. She was capping the chart pen when her phone buzzed. Rourke. A text this time. Administrative floor. When you have a minute. She put the chart down, told Hargrove she'd check back later, and went downstairs. The administrative floor had been transformed in the hours she'd been away from it. The records room was fully taped off. The conference room where Pollock had met with the board, and where he'd been held before his attorney's county-level maneuver, had federal personnel in it with laptops and document scanners. The administrative assistant's desk, which had always had a particular chaotic energy from the stacked patient billing files, was now a federal evidence staging area with labeled bags and chain of custody tags. Rourke was in the corridor outside Pollock's former office. The door was open. Come look at something, she said. Nora came. Pollock's office was not large, standard administrative issue. Desk, credenza, 2 chairs, a framed photograph of the hospital's exterior taken on a day when the building looked better than it usually did. The federal team had been through it methodically. The desk drawers were out and labeled. The credenza was open. On the desk was a printed document. Not original, a federal copy, with an evidence marker. Rourke pointed at it. This was in the bottom drawer of the credenza, she said, under a false base. It took our evidence tech 20 minutes to find it. Nora looked at the document. It was a list, typed, formatted, dated at irregular intervals going back 41 months. 2 columns, patient names on the left, and on the right, brief descriptors. Not medical terminology. Shorthand, coded language that nonetheless was not difficult to read once you understood what you were looking at. Patients who had pushed back. Patients who had complained formally. A nurse in 2022, Delacroix, the name from the thread, with a notation that read, resolved, no escalation, 2 orderlies. A physician's assistant who had apparently filed an internal grievance and was noted as transferred, case closed. And at the bottom of the most recent page, added in handwriting rather than type, 3 words next to a date from 2 weeks ago. The date was 10 days before Hargrove had disappeared on Route 9. The name next to the date was not a patient. It was Hargrove's name. And the 3 handwritten words next to it were liability, coordinate disposal. Nora looked at the document for a long moment. The language was bureaucratic in the way that made it worse, not better. The casual administrative register of someone who had reduced the decision to harm a person to the same verbal register as a budget line item. He knew Hargrove was coming, she said. He knew. The leak from the Oversight Committee, Callaway, gave him Hargrove's identity and the timeline of the Billings meeting 2 weeks before it happened. Rourke's voice was even. He coordinated with the management group. They handled the operational side, the vehicle, Route 9. Pollock's role was documentation management, making sure that if Hargrove ended up in Cascade Ridge, the records wouldn't reflect anything useful. A pause. He didn't know Hargrove would end up here specifically, but he'd prepared for the possibility. Nora thought about Pollock coming through the administrative entrance at 11:15 on the night of a declared weather emergency. She'd read it as financial risk management, an administrator protecting quarterly metrics. It was that. It was also something else. He'd come in because a patient had arrived who might be Hargrove. He'd come in to manage the exposure. And when a nurse had refused to cooperate with his management of that exposure, he'd moved on her fast and hard because she was standing between him and a situation that could end him. The document, she said, is it enough? It's not the spine of the case, the drive from the culvert is, but it establishes premeditation and it connects Pollock directly to the attempt on Hargrove's life. Rourke paused. The healthcare management group is going to have a difficult few months. 3 of their executives are named in Callaway's cooperation statement. Federal warrants are executing in Billings and Bozeman this afternoon. Nora stood in the office that had belonged to Warren Pollock for 2 years and looked at the document with his handwriting on it and thought about the specific clarity that comes when a thing you suspected turns out to be exactly what you suspected and somehow still lands harder than you expected. What happens to the hospital, she said. Federal oversight for the duration of the investigation. The board has appointed an interim director, Dr. Stein, as of this morning pending a formal search. She accepted conditionally, which apparently means she's already renegotiating the surgical call schedule. Nora almost smiled at that. The nursing staff who gave statements last night, she said, they need protection from any board-level retaliation while the oversight is running. Federal whistleblower protections apply. They've all been formally notified. Rourke looked at her. You're still thinking like the charge nurse. Someone has to. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through her expression. Not quite the operational neutrality of the past 18 hours, something adjacent to what had briefly cracked through when Nora had come out of surgery the first time. Recognition of something she wasn't going to put into words. There's going to be a formal review of the suspension action, she said. Cascade Ridge's HR file on you will reflect that the suspension was retaliatory, procedurally invalid, and executed during an active patient emergency in violation of multiple state nursing board guidelines. She paused. That review is a formality. I wanted you to know it's happening. Nora nodded. And your temporary credential, Rourke said, was authorized by federal oversight. But Dr. Stein has already submitted a formal reinstatement request to HR, effective today. Full status. Nora looked at the window of Pollock's former office, a different angle than from the nursing floor. Wider view, the parking lot visible, the tree line beyond it, the blue post-storm sky going gold at the edges as the afternoon ran down. She thought about 3 years of overnight shifts and cold coffee and the discipline of not looking too far in either direction. She thought about Shay's call and Hargrove's words and the program that wasn't a ceremony and wasn't a medal and was instead something that might actually require something of her. She thought about Dolores Marsh, who had spent 2 years believing a lie about how her husband died and who had not cried on the call but had needed to know it was real. She was about to say something to Rourke when her phone rang. Tate's number. She picked up immediately. "What is it?" "He's asking for you again." A pause. "But that's not why I'm calling." Another pause, shorter, tighter. "We just got a call to the nursing floor from the hospital's main reception. Someone asked for Hargrove's room number." "That's standard. You don't give that out without—" "I know, we didn't give it, but the person calling identified themselves as a family member. And then when reception asked for a name to verify, they said—" Tate stopped. "Said what?" "They said Pollock. Said they were Warren Pollock's assistant calling on behalf of the family." The gold in the afternoon sky outside the window had gone flat. Nora was already moving. "Lock the floor," she said. "Right now. Nobody goes into that room who isn't nursing or federal. Nobody." "Should I call—" "I'm calling Rourke. You lock the floor." She ended the call and turned. Rourke was already looking at her. "Pollock's in federal custody," Rourke said. But she was saying it like someone testing whether they believed it, and the answer on her face was not entirely certain. "He was taken in at 9:47, Nora said. "What facility?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be alarming. Rourke was on her phone before Nora finished the question. The answer came back in 40 seconds. Rourke's expression went through something that Nora had not seen on her face in 18 hours of a very difficult night. "He was transferred from the initial federal holding facility at 11:15 this morning," she said, "for a medical assessment, standard procedure." Another pause. "The transport vehicle arrived at St. Francis Medical in Billings at 11:50. He was assessed and cleared." She looked up. "He was discharged at 1:30. And then nobody signed him back into federal custody." Rourke's voice was very controlled. There was a procedural failure between the transport team and the receiving federal agent. He walked out of St. Francis at 1:30 with his attorney, and we don't have current location. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. Pollock had been loose for over an hour, and someone using his name had just called the hospital asking for Hargrove's room. Nora was moving before Rourke finished the sentence. She took the stairs because the elevator had a 7-second wait she wasn't willing to give it, and she came through the surgical floor door at a pace that made the corridor nurse look up from the desk with the specific alarmed attention of someone who reads urgency in body language before they process the reason for it. "Is the floor locked?" Nora said without stopping. "Tate did it 2 minutes ago. Badge access only past the junction. Who's in the building that shouldn't be? Nobody came through up here. We've had 2 family visitors all day. Both verified, both gone by noon." Nora went to Hargrove's step-down room. She pushed the door open. He was awake. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw in it made him try to sit up, which his body did not support, and he settled back with a controlled grimace. "What happened?" he said. "Pollock may be loose." She moved to the window first. Ground floor sightlines from a step-down room were a problem, but the step-down wing was on the building's east side, and the window looked onto a maintenance alley, not the parking lot or main approach. She pulled the blind anyway. "Someone called reception asking for your room using his name." "His name or someone using his name?" "We don't know." She turned back to him. "Federal custody had a handoff failure. He may have walked out of a medical facility in Billings at 1:30. Hargrove processed that with the particular speed of someone whose background makes bad news math automatic. That's over an hour." "Yes." "He has an attorney with him." "Yes." "The attorney knows where the case stands. If Pollock is trying to run, the attorney is either enabling it or about to separate himself as fast as possible." He paused, thinking. If he's not running, if the call was something else, then we're being careful about nothing, she said. I'll take that outcome. She went back to the door and looked down the corridor. Tate was at the recovery desk, on the phone, watching the junction door. Two of the day nurses were visible further down. The floor had the contained, alert quality of people who understood something was happening and had decided to be useful about it. Her phone buzzed. Rourke. She picked up. "We have him," Rourke said. "He's at the Billings airport. TSA flagged his passport. We had a travel alert on him that the custody failure didn't update in time to pull. He was attempting to board a flight to Vancouver." Nora let out a slow breath. "His attorney," she said, "was with him. The attorney is going to have a very interesting few months. Facilitating the movement of a federal detainee is not covered under attorney-client privilege." A pause. "Pollock is in physical federal custody as of 8 minutes ago. He's being transported to the federal detention facility in Helena. No more county channels, no more jurisdiction arguments." Another pause. "The call to reception this morning, we think it was his attorney's paralegal trying to establish whether Hargrove was well enough to give testimony. Threat assessment, not an actual approach." Rourke's voice carried the controlled relief of someone who has been running contingencies for the past hour and is now standing down. "It's over, Vance." She stood in the doorway of Hargrove's room with her phone at her ear and looked at him. He was watching her face, reading it. She lowered the phone. "He's in federal custody," she said. "Helena." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Something in him settled. The same quality she'd noticed when he'd talked about the documentation being secured, but deeper now. More final. "Good," he said. Just that. She went back into the room and pulled the chair to the bedside and sat down in it, which was the first time she'd sat down voluntarily in the better part of 18 hours. Her body registered the chair with a kind of profound gratitude that she chose not to examine too closely. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. Outside the pulled blind, she could hear the afternoon sounds of the hospital in its normal register. The PA system, a cart moving down the corridor, someone laughing at the nurse's station. The ordinary machinery of a building that kept running through everything, as buildings did. Awesome. The days that followed moved in the specific way that aftermath moves. Not fast, not cinematic, but with the weight of real consequences finding their final shapes. The federal charges against Warren Pollock were filed in full on the third day after his arrest. 17 counts spanning healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and a separate count of conspiracy to commit assault related to the documented coordination of the Route 9 incident. The charging document was 42 pages. The 3 patient names were in the first paragraph of the summary, above Pollock's name, which was a deliberate prosecutorial choice that the lead federal attorney told Rourke was non-negotiable from the beginning. Dolores Marsh, whose husband Arthur had died in March of 2021 after a delayed treatment authorization that Pollock had coded as a patient refusal, gave a statement to the Federal Victim Witness Office on the 4th day. She drove in from her ranch outside Garrison Falls in a 15-year-old pickup with mud on the running boards and sat in the federal field office and talked for 2 hours. When she was done, the victim witness coordinator said she'd been doing this work for 9 years, and Dolores Marsh was the clearest, most composed witness she'd ever taken a statement from. Dolores said she wasn't composed, she was just finished being quiet. Her civil suit was filed 6 days later. The other 2 families filed within the week. Nurse Delacroix's 2022 wrongful suppression case, the conduct action Pollock had used to silence her, was formally reviewed by the state nursing board and expunged from her professional record. She cried in the parking lot afterward, and then was embarrassed about it, and then decided she wasn't going to be embarrassed about it. She'd told Priya about it, and Priya had told Nora, and Nora thought that was exactly the right sequence of feelings in exactly the right order. The healthcare management group that had coordinated with Pollock saw 4 of its senior executives indicted in a separate but related federal action. Their Montana and Wyoming operations were placed under federal receivership. The shell company that owned the vehicle used on Route 9 was dissolved, its assets frozen, and its registered agent, a man named Tolliver, who operated out of an address in Scottsdale and had never personally spoken to Pollock, found himself the subject of a conspiracy charge he spent 3 months trying to argue his way out of before pleading guilty to a reduced count. Calloway received a cooperation agreement. 18 months, supervised release, dishonorable discharge from his federal coordinating role, permanent bar from government service. It was not justice in the fullest sense of the word. It was the architecture of a case that needed his testimony more than it needed his incarceration. And Nora had made her peace with the distinction because the alternative was a cleaner moral outcome with a weaker case, and a weaker case meant more uncertainty for Dolores Marsh and the other two families. She still didn't like it. She didn't have to like it for it to be the right call. Hargrove was discharged on the 9th day. He walked out of Cascade Ridge under his own power, slowly, with the specific, deliberate gait of a man whose body was reminding him at every step that 2 surgeries in one night had consequences that didn't resolve on a schedule he controlled. He had a follow-up appointment with Stein in 2 weeks. He had 6 more weeks of recovery minimum before he could travel, testify, or do anything that required sustained physical or cognitive output. He stood at the main entrance on the way out and looked at the building for a moment, then at Nora, who had walked down with him. "You're going to call Shay," he said. Not a question. "I'm going to listen to what he has to say," she said. That's what I told him. "You know what you're going to decide." She looked at the entrance doors, at the hospital lobby visible through them, at the nursing station beyond that where Priya was on the phone and Okafor was reading a chart, and the ordinary, imperfect, necessary work of the place was running as it always did. "Maybe," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. The calculation was still there. She'd stopped minding it. It was just how he saw things, and he'd used it to carry something important across 11 days and 2 surgeries, and she wasn't going to fault the habit. "Sergeant Vance," he said. "Just Vance." "Just Vance." He nodded once. "Thank you." She put her hands in her coat pockets. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Montana winter day that was beautiful in a way that asked nothing of you and gave nothing back, just existed at a level of austere visual fact that you could appreciate or not, as you chose. "Don't get run off any more roads," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll do my best." She watched him get into the waiting car, a federal transport, 2 agents, proper custody this time, and she stood in the cold until it pulled out of the lot and turned onto the main road and disappeared behind the tree line. Then she went back inside. She called Shay that afternoon. She'd been putting it together in pieces since Hargrove had first mentioned it from the recovery bed, and she'd been honest enough with herself in the quiet moments of the past 9 days to acknowledge that the putting together had started before that. Had started maybe the second time she walked back into Cascade Ridge at 1 a.m. in a federal credential in scrubs, moving through a building she knew well toward a patient she'd refused to leave, and had felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years that she could only describe as the specific weight of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She didn't romanticize it. The weight wasn't comfortable. It wasn't clean. It had cost her 2 surgeries worth of sustained attention in a single night and weeks of procedural aftermath, and her name in a federal document and a journalist's article that had been picked up by 4 regional outlets and then by 2 national healthcare publications that focused on patient safety and institutional accountability. It had cost her the quiet anonymity she'd built carefully over 3 years, and she was not sure yet what the full price of that would be. But it had also given her Delacroix's expunged record and Dolores Marsh driving in from her ranch to be done being quiet. It had given her Stein saying welcome back in an OR at 3 a.m. in a tone that was not a compliment but a statement of professional fact. It had given her Tate texting he's awake and asking for you, seems annoyed you're not here in a way that had almost made her smile and had made her drive back to the hospital when she could have stayed home. These things were real. She was going to let them be real. Shay answered on the second ring and she talked to him for an hour and 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd intended and shorter than what the conversation required. And at the end of it, she said she needed a week to think, and he said take 2, and she appreciated that he didn't press. She took 1. The program Shay described was not a government initiative in the traditional sense. It was a partnership model, federally funded but operationally decentralized, designed to build crisis medical response capacity in rural civilian facilities using instructors with combined clinical and tactical experience. The gap it addressed was specific and well documented. Rural hospitals had high rates of preventable death in mass casualty and multi-system trauma events because their staff had clinical training, but no exposure to the decision-making frameworks that made the difference between managed chaos and collapse. The model was designed around instruction, real instruction, hands-on, scenario-based, the kind of training that required someone who had been in rooms where things went wrong and had made decisions under that pressure and could transfer not just technique, but the interior landscape of how to think when the situation was moving faster than the protocol. Shea had 4 facilities already in the program. He wanted to expand to 12 in the first year, primarily in Montana, Wyoming, and the rural corridor running through the Dakotas. He needed an experienced clinical lead who could design and run the curriculum and spend time on site at each facility. He needed someone who understood what it was like when the options were bad and the clock was running and the person in front of you was going to die if you didn't decide. He needed, in short, someone who was not interested in what the job looked like from the outside and was interested in what it could actually do. Nora called him back on the 8th day, which was 1 day before she'd said she would, because she'd made the decision on the 5th day and spent 3 days checking it. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would," Shea said. "I keep my civilian designation. I don't want the military framework around the work. It closes doors in certain facilities, and I need those facilities to be willing to engage." Agreed. Cascade Ridge is the first site. The staff here went through something that exposed a lot of gaps. If I'm building a curriculum, I'm building it from what I know is real, not from a theoretical baseline. "That's actually the model we'd prefer," Shea said, "and I consult on the structure, not just the content. If there are administrative decisions that affect the program's access to facilities, I need a voice in them." A brief pause. "That'll require some paperwork, but yes." She looked at her apartment. The radiator was ticking again, still not producing adequate heat. She'd been meaning to deal with that for months. It occurred to her that she probably wasn't going to live here long enough to make it worth calling the landlord. "Then yes," she said. Her last overnight shift at Cascade Ridge was on a Tuesday in late January, 6 weeks after the blizzard. She'd asked Stein if she could work it, not as a formality, not as a goodbye performance, but because there was a patient in bed 7 who had been admitted 3 days ago with a complicated post-surgical infection, and who Nora had been tracking for 2 shifts, and who she didn't want handed off mid-course without a personal handover note. Stein had said yes, obviously, in the tone she used when she thought a question was unnecessary. The shift ran quiet until about 2 in the morning, which was the hospital's version of quiet. 2 new admissions, 1 cardiac event that resolved without escalation, a confused elderly patient in bed 4 who needed reorienting twice, and who called Nora by his daughter's name, which she didn't correct because it seemed to help him settle. She wrote the handover note on the post-surgical patient at 5:30, detailed enough that whoever followed her would have everything they needed. She flagged 3 things to watch. She left her cell number at the bottom, which was against the strict technical protocol for shift notes, and which she did anyway because the protocol was wrong and the patient's safety was more important than her adherence to a rule that existed for administrative tidiness. At 6:15, Priya came into the break room where Nora was finishing the last of the shift paperwork. She sat down across from her without being asked. "Is it weird?" Priya said. "Leaving?" Nora thought about it honestly. "A little. You don't look like it's weird. I've had practice not looking like things are what they are." Priya looked at her. She was 26 years old, and she had come through the worst night of her clinical career, and had held the floor and had stepped up when it mattered, and had not flinched when she needed not to flinch. She was going to be excellent. She probably already knew that, and was still in the process of believing it, which was how it usually worked. "The stuff you did that night," Priya said. "The way you moved through everything. I've been going over it." She paused. "I want to be able to do that." "You did do it," Nora said. "You were there the whole time." "Not the way you did. Different things," Nora said. "I had experience you don't have yet. You had composure under pressure that I had to learn the hard way." She paused. "You also kept the floor running while I was in OR. That matters as much." Priya looked at the table, then back up. "Will you come back for the training program?" "That's the plan." "Good." She stood up. "I'll actually pay attention this time." Nora smiled. It came out more easily than she expected. She submitted her final shift report at 6:47, signed out at the nursing station, and took her coat from the locker for the last time. She stood in the locker room for a moment. The building had its 6 a.m. sounds. The PA, the cartwheels, the distant rhythmic pressure of a ventilator down the hall that she identified by sound without needing to see it. She'd learned this building the way you learn places you occupy through long, quiet attention, not its layout or its official structure, but its actual texture, its rhythms, the particular way it breathed at different hours. She would miss that. She was going to miss it specifically, which was different from the general ache of leaving something, and she let herself feel the difference rather than compressing it into something easier to carry. She went out through the main entrance this time. Not the administrative entrance, not the side door. The main emergency entrance, the one that faced the parking lot and the road and the tree line, and beyond that, the mountains that were visible on clear days as a blue-white line along the horizon, close enough to read as presence and far enough to be abstract. The morning was cold and still. The sky was the particular clean blue that followed a clear Montana night, deep at the zenith and paling toward the east, where the sun was already up and doing its insufficient winter work. She stopped on the steps. She thought about a woman who had driven in from a ranch outside Garrison Falls in a mud-running pickup because she was done being quiet. She thought about a nurse whose record had been expunged and who had decided she wasn't going to be embarrassed about crying in a parking lot. She thought about a staff thread that had gone active at 4 a.m. because one nurse had said someone needs to say something and 60 people had agreed. She thought about 8 men on a mountain and 16 hours and the one she hadn't saved in time, which was a weight she was still carrying and might always carry and had stopped expecting to set down completely. She'd been wrong, she thought, to believe that carrying it meant she had to carry it alone. She'd been wrong to believe that the only way to honor what she'd lost was to make herself smaller than what she was. Some lessons you learn the first time. Some you have to be thrown out into a blizzard to find. She walked down the steps and across the parking lot to her car. She had a meeting with Shay's team in 2 days to begin the curriculum design. She had a call with the Federal Victim Witness Coordinator to give a final procedural statement. She had an appointment with a landlord about breaking her lease, which was going to be an uncomfortable conversation she'd been postponing for 10 days. She had things to do. Real things, specific things, the kind of things that were not clean or simple but were necessary, and hers. She got into the car and started the engine. Sat for a moment. She was not the same person who had poured terrible break room coffee at the start of the overnight shift 6 weeks ago. That person had been doing the work of getting through days without asking what the days were for. The work had been real. The patients had been real. What she'd given them had been real. But the shape of it had been shaped by avoidance as much as purpose, and she knew the difference now with a clarity she hadn't had before the blizzard. You could be competent and still be hiding. You could be useful and still be diminished. You could pour everything you had into a quiet room and tell yourself it was enough, and be wrong, not because the quiet room didn't matter, but because you were meant for more rooms than one. She didn't know what the program would look like in a year. She didn't know which facilities would engage and which would resist, and which administrators would be Pollacks in waiting and which would be Steins. She didn't know what it would cost her or what it would give her or how many nights it would ask for that she hadn't yet budgeted. She knew she would do it anyway. She pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the main road and drove toward Garrison Falls proper, toward her apartment, and the radiator she was going to stop being annoyed by because she was leaving, toward the coffee that would be better than the hospital break room because almost anything was, toward the 2 days before the meeting in which she intended to sleep a genuine amount and possibly eat a vegetable. In her rearview mirror, the hospital got smaller. The parking lot, the entrance, the building that had housed 3 years of her life in one very long night, that had cracked something open she hadn't known was still there. She watched it until the road curved and the tree line took it. Then she faced forward and drove. The mountains on the horizon were clear today. White peaks against blue sky, exact and enormous, the kind of view that had no agenda and asked nothing and simply was. She'd driven past them for 3 years and had mostly looked at the road. Today she looked at the mountains. They looked back the way large things do, without judgment, without comfort, without the particular human need to make meaning out of what they saw. That was fine. She had enough meaning of her own. She drove on,